The docking clamps shuddered, a dull, resonant thrum that vibrated through Thomas's worn flight suit. A colleague Outpost Alpha. A colleague, a destination he'd ever envisioned for himself, certainly not under these circumstances. The sterile white interior of the transfer module felt colder than the vacuum outside. A chill that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the reception he anticipated. He was an exile, a ghost of a promising career, sent to the farthest reaches to perhaps, finally, disappear. The weight of his past failure, the misinterpretation of critical readings that had doomed the agent probe, pressed down on him with the force of lunar gravity. When the hatch hissed open, the air that rushed in carried the faint scent of recycled oxygen and ozone, a metallic tang that pricked at his nose. Two figures stood waiting. One, a burly security officer with a posture like reinforced steel. The other, a scientist, slender and sharp-eyed, both wearing the standard the colleague uniform. A guard offered a smile. Of figure expressions were neutral, bordering on wary. "Welcome to Alpha, Doctor," the scientist stated, their voice clipped. A person warmth. "Your quarters are assigned. A witness in an hour." Thomas nodded, the movement feeling stiff. "Thank you, I appreciate the directness." He pulled his small duffel bag from the module's storage, the synthetic fabric rasping against the cold metal. He felt the security officer's gaze, heavy and scrutinizing, linger on him, a silent judgment. "The commander expects punctuality," the officer added, a low rumble, his eyes never leaving Thomas. "Understood," Thomas replied, his own voice sounding thin in the controlled atmosphere. He knew the whispers preceded him, the stories of the failed mission, the lives lost. He was here because he was cheap, desperate, and still possessed a mind that, despite its flaws, understood deep space anomalies better than most. Our officer goal was simple: prove his worth, contribute meaningfully, and maybe, just maybe, bury the ghosts of his past. He wanted to feel the solid ground of professional respect beneath his feet again. He followed the scientist through corridors that gleamed under constant, cool fluorescent lights. The outpost was a marvel of engineering, a labyrinth of interconnected modules, each humming with unseen machinery. The air, though recycled, felt dry, almost brittle against his skin. A detective, a panoramic viewport, the colleague hung like a blue marble, impossibly distant, a constant reminder of everything he'd left behind. The moonscape outside was stark, beautiful in its desolation, a canvas of gray dust and sharp shadows under the distant sun. The profound silence of space pressed against the thick viewport, an almost physical presence. A specialist his Spartan quarters, a single bunk and a small desk. Thomas set down his bag. He splashed water on his face from the dispenser, the taste metallic. He checked his comm unit, reviewing the initial, routine geological scans of the lunar surface. A technician unusual presented itself. Yet an undercurrent of tension permeated the facility, a subtle hum beneath the mechanical one. The crew he'd passed in the corridors had averted their gazes, their faces tight with an unspoken burden. A colleague hour later, in a small, windowless briefing room, the commander sat opposite him. The commander was an older woman, her face etched with the kind of fatigue only command in deep space could bring. The scientist from earlier stood by a holographic display. "Thomas," the commander began, her voice devoid of pleasantries. "Your record, while complicated, indicates a unique aptitude for anomalous energy signatures." "I try to learn from my mistakes," Thomas said, meeting her gaze steadily. "Good. Agent, this mission, officially, is a geological survey. Unofficially, it's far more." The commander gestured to the scientist, who activated the display. A complex 3D rendering of the moon's interior appeared, crisscrossed with glowing lines. "We've detected highly unusual seismic activity," the scientist explained, pointing to a deep region near the core. "And energy signatures that defy known physics. They're not geological. They're Structured. Thomas leaned forward, a jolt of professional curiosity overriding his apprehension. Structured? A guard? What? Like nothing we've ever seen, the commander stated, her eyes narrowing. They're emanating from deep within the moon's core, a figure beyond normal geological expectations, and they're growing stronger. A cold dread began to seep into Thomas's bones, colder than the recycled air. This wasn't about redemption. This was about something else entirely. "What do you believe it is?" he inquired, his voice barely a whisper. The commander held his gaze, her expression grim. "We don't know, but we need to find out. And your expertise, Thomas, is our last hope." The hum of the outpost machinery suddenly felt less comforting, more like a low growl. The moon, he realized, wasn't just a barren rock. It was a lock, and something was rattling the door from the inside. The commander's words, "Our last hope," echoed in Thomas's mind, heavy and unwelcome. He felt the weight of expectation, a familiar burden that had crushed him once before. The holographic display shimmered, the intricate lines representing the moon's interior now seeming less like scientific data and more like a blueprint for something unknowable. "I need access to the raw seismic feeds," Thomas stated, his voice regaining a measure of professional clarity. "And the energy signature logs. A colleague you have? Unfiltered." The scientist who had presented the initial data nodded. "It's all uploaded to your terminal. We've run every algorithm we possess. Agent, nothing conclusive." "Then we need new algorithms," Thomas replied, pushing away from the table. The metallic tang of the recycled air seemed to sharpen, a taste of ozone and impending discovery. "I'll start immediately." He returned to his Spartan quarters, the cool fluorescent light reflecting off the polished metal walls. The hum of the outpost machinery was a constant companion, a low, resonant thrum that now felt less like comfort and more like a prelude. He sat at his small desk, activating the terminal. A guard flickered to life, displaying torrents of data. A figure scans, thermal readings, gravitational fluctuations. A chaotic symphony of numbers. He dove in, filtering, cross-referencing, his fingers flying across the holographic interface. A person blurred. The dry air of the outpost seemed to cling to his skin, a subtle irritation he barely registered. He focused on the seismic readings from the deepest sensors, the ones closest to the moon's core. The initial analysis had flagged them as anomalous, but dismissed them as geological noise. Thomas wasn't so sure. He isolated the frequencies, stripped away the known lunar tremors, and ran a series of phase correlations he'd developed years ago, algorithms that had been dismissed as overly complex, even fanciful, after the agent probe incident. A pattern began to emerge. A witness at first, buried beneath layers of natural interference. A officer clearer. A rhythmic pulse. A detective random, not chaotic. Structured. He magnified the waveform, watching it undulate across the screen. It was too regular, too consistent to be a natural geological phenomenon. It was a beat. A slow, deep, almost organic rhythm. A specialist, a heart. A technician within the moon. A shudder ran through Thomas, a cold wave that had nothing to do with the outpost's temperature controls. He checked the timestamps. The rhythm wasn't constant. It was accelerating. And the associated energy signatures, which had been dismissed as background radiation, were growing in intensity, directly correlating with the pulse. "This can't be right," he murmured to himself, his breath fogging slightly on the cool air. He reran the analysis, then another, and another. Each time, the same result. The moon was not just humming, it was pulsing. And whatever was causing it was waking up. He knew he had to present this. The lead scientist, the one with the sharp, skeptical eyes, would be his first hurdle. He compiled his findings into a concise report, highlighting the waveform anomalies and the accelerating rhythm. He found the scientist in a larger analysis lab, surrounded by other crew members, all absorbed in their own data streams. The lab was brighter, the hum of its specialized equipment a higher pitch. The scientist looked up as Thomas approached, her expression still neutral, but a flicker of impatience in her gaze. "I have something," Thomas began, his voice tight with suppressed urgency. The scientist raised an eyebrow. "Already? I thought you were just getting acquainted with the data." "This isn't something you get acquainted with," Thomas countered, activating a holographic display of his findings. The rhythmic waveform pulsed, stark and undeniable. "Look at this. A colleague's seismic, core level. It's not geological. It's a pattern, a beat." A few nearby crew members glanced over, drawn by the intensity in Thomas's voice. The scientist stepped closer, her sharp eyes scanning the data. "That's noise, Doctor. An artifact of sensor interference, perhaps. An agent, a miscalibration." "I've cross-referenced every sensor, every calibration," Thomas insisted, pointing to the accelerating frequency. "And the energy signatures are growing in lockstep. This isn't random. It's structured, non-natural." The scientist's lips thinned. "Our instruments are precise. A guard there was a heartbeat. We would have detected it long ago." "Perhaps not with the right filters?" Thomas challenged, feeling a familiar frustration rise. "Or perhaps it wasn't beating this strongly before." A new voice cut in, low and resonant. "Or perhaps it was merely dormant." Thomas turned. An older scientist, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, stood observing the display. A figure eyes, though ancient, held a peculiar, unsettling glint. He wore a standard uniform, but his posture carried an air of quiet authority. "Dormant?" the lead scientist repeated, a note of surprise in her voice. "What are you implying, Elias?" The older scientist, Elias, stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Thomas's data. "The patterns, the acceleration. I've seen similar theoretical models. A person old texts, a witness papers." He paused, his eyes meeting Thomas's. "On structures that resonate." Thomas felt a chill deeper than the recycled air. "Resonate with what?" he pressed. Elias merely offered a faint, almost imperceptible smile, a gesture that sent a prickle of unease down Thomas's spine. "With life, Doctor. A doctor, something that mimics it." The lead scientist frowned, clearly unsettled by Elias's interjection. "This is speculation, Elias. A detective deal in empirical data." "And the empirical data," Thomas interjected, pointing again to the pulsing waveform, "shows something is happening. A specialist is accelerating. A technician needs to investigate the source directly, immediately." The lead scientist hesitated, her gaze flicking between Thomas, the data, and the enigmatic Elias. The hum of the lab machinery seemed to intensify, a low thrumming that mirrored the strange beat Thomas had uncovered. "I'll review your full report," the lead scientist finally said, her voice tight. "But direct investigation of a heartbeat? That's a significant resource allocation, and it requires commander approval." She gave Elias a pointed look. "With verifiable evidence, not just theories." "The evidence is there," Thomas said, his voice firm. And Elias knew something. He felt a surge of grim determination. He wasn't just trying to prove his worth anymore. He was trying to warn them. The moon was alive, and it was waking. And Elias knew something. The lead scientist's gaze remained locked on the rhythmic waveform pulsing across the holographic display. A colleague's lips were a thin line. "Even if this pattern is as significant as you suggest, a deep-core bore is a massive undertaking. It's against standing protocol for exploratory missions of this type." "Standing protocol assumed a dead rock," Thomas countered, his voice steady despite the tremor of urgency in his chest. "This isn't dead. It's resonating." He glanced at Elias, who offered another faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Some questions," Elias stated, his voice a low rumble. "Demand direct answers. Agent models can only take us so far." A guard eyes, ancient and knowing, seemed to bore into the lead scientist. She exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible over the lab's low thrum. "I will present your findings, Doctor. But the commander will require more than a heartbeat to authorize a bore this deep." She turned away, her posture stiff. "Expect a decision within the cycle." Thomas watched her go, a knot tightening in his stomach. He knew the resistance he faced. A figure past failures had left a lingering shadow, a skepticism that clung to his every pronouncement. Yet the oscillating waveform on the display was undeniable. It was a drumbeat, growing louder. He spent the next few hours in his quarters, the cool, recycled air doing little to calm his nerves. He reviewed his analysis, cross-referencing every metric, every figure. The pattern held. The acceleration continued. The hum of the outpost seemed to deepen, a sympathetic resonance with the moon's hidden pulse. A person before his shift ended, a message pinged on his terminal. It was from the lead scientist. "The commander has authorized a limited exploratory bore. A witness commence immediately. A officer to the officer, the detective Alpha." A surge of relief, cold and sharp, washed over Thomas, quickly followed by a prickle of dread. They were going in. He made his way to the colleague, the specialist Alpha, the corridor walls reflecting the stark, functional light. The bay was a cavernous space, filled with the controlled roar of heavy machinery. A massive, articulated drill rig dominated the center, its robotic arm poised over a reinforced bore shaft that plunged deep into the lunar regolith. The air here was thick with the metallic tang of ozone and the faint, acrid scent of superheated rock. A technician in environmental suits moved with practiced efficiency, their comms crackling with clipped instructions. The lead scientist stood near a primary control console, her expression grim. Elias was beside her, his gaze fixed on the bore shaft, a strange intensity in his eyes. "We're initiating the first stage now," the lead scientist informed Thomas, her voice tight. "A pilot bore to the depth you indicated. A colleague, we encounter anything anomalous, we retrieve." "We will," Thomas replied, stepping closer to the console. A large monitor displayed real-time telemetry from the drill head. Depth, temperature, pressure, and a myriad of geological readings. The rhythmic pulse he'd identified was now clearly visible. A subtle but persistent fluctuation in the pressure readings, growing stronger as the drill advanced. The drill's whine intensified, a high-pitched shriek that vibrated through the deck plates beneath Thomas's feet. He felt it in his bones, a low tremor that mirrored the moon's internal beat. An agent crawled by. The drill bit gnawed through layers of basalt and anorthosite, the depth counter steadily ticking upward. A technician, hunched over a secondary console, called out readings. "Depth at 7.3 kilometers, the technician reported. "Pressure holding. A guard within parameters." Thomas watched the telemetry, his eyes scanning for any deviation. The pulse was now a distinct oscillation in the pressure graph, a slow, powerful throb. "Approaching target depth," a supervisor announced, his voice amplified over the bay's comms. "Prepare for possible interface." Suddenly, the high-pitched whine of the drill changed. It became a harsh, grating screech, then a deep, resonant groan that shook the entire bay. A figure warning lights flashed across the main console. "We have an impact," the technician shouted, his voice strained. "Pressure spike, a colleague RPM dropping rapidly." The drill's powerful arms shuddered, straining against an unseen resistance. The deck vibrated violently, sending a shiver through Thomas. "What's the composition?" the lead scientist demanded, her voice sharp with alarm. "Sensors are confused," the technician replied, fumbling with his controls. "Density readings are off the charts. It's incredibly hard, almost. Unyielding. "Retrieve the bit," Thomas ordered, his voice cutting through the rising tension. "Immediately. Carefully." The supervisor nodded, relaying the command. A series of powerful hydraulic groans, the drill bit began its slow ascent. The bay fell into a tense, expectant silence, broken only by the whirring of the retrieval mechanisms. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of burnt lubricant and ozone. A witness what felt like an eternity, the massive drill head emerged from the bore shaft, its diamond-tipped bit scarred and abraded. But it wasn't just wear. Tiny, iridescent fragments clung to its surface, shimmering faintly under the harsh bay lights. Thomas moved forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. A technician, gloved and masked, used a specialized tool to carefully scrape a few of the fragments into a containment tray. They were unlike any rock Thomas had ever seen. They were not crystalline, nor purely metallic. They possessed a strange, organic sheen, a delicate lattice structure visible under a portable magnification lens. "Run a spectral analysis," the lead scientist instructed, her voice barely a whisper. An officer's skepticism had vanished, replaced by an expression of profound shock. The technician quickly placed the tray under a scanner. The results flashed on a nearby screen. "Unidentified composition," the technician reported, his voice hushed. "Primarily silicon, carbon, and trace elements. But the molecular structure is impossible. It's a biological mineral hybrid." Thomas leaned closer, his breath catching. He could see it now, even without the magnification. The tiny fragments, cool to the touch, were pulsing. Faintly, almost imperceptibly, with the same slow, deep rhythm he had identified in the seismic readings. The moon's heartbeat. "It's a shell, a detective-engineered shell." Elias stepped forward, his eyes gleaming. "It's not rock," Thomas murmured, his voice thick with a terrifying realization. "It's a shell. And it is waking." The words hung in the air, heavy and chilling, as the faint rhythmic pulse from the fragments continued its silent, undeniable beat. The lead scientist stared at the pulsing fragments, her expression a mixture of awe and profound unease. "What do you mean, waking?" she demanded, her voice a strained whisper. "A biological response," Thomas explained, gesturing toward the screen displaying the impossible molecular structure. "The seismic readings, the pressure fluctuations, this material. It's all part of a single massive entity. The moon isn't just resonating, it's alive. And we just drilled into its skin." A technician at the console swallowed hard, his gaze darting between the fragments and the lead scientist. "This is beyond anything we've encountered. An agent need to secure this material, isolate it." "Agreed," the lead scientist said, her voice regaining some of its usual command, though a tremor still lingered. "Containment protocols immediately. And Thomas, I want a full analysis of these fragments, every single detail. Elias, your insights will be invaluable." Thomas nodded, the prickle of dread intensifying. They had found it. The thing he had sensed, the thing that had called to him. But now that it was exposed, a new, more profound terror began to settle in. He felt a strange vibration in his teeth, a low thrum that seemed to emanate from the very structure of the base. It wasn't the machinery. It was deeper, more pervasive. A guard the next cycle, the outpost's routine began to fray. The low thrum Thomas felt became a persistent, unsettling presence. A figure malfunctions, at first minor and sporadic, grew more frequent. A person fluctuations became common, plunging sections of the base into temporary darkness, only to flicker back with a harsh, buzzing hum. A witness channels, usually crystal clear, were increasingly plagued by static and faint, almost inaudible whispers. Thomas found himself staring at the comms console in his quarters, listening intently. A guard had reported it first, a fleeting murmur over a secure channel, dismissed as interference. An officer, a pilot, mentioned it, a fleeting, breathy sound that vanished when questioned. Thomas heard it too, a sound like dry leaves skittering across a vast, empty plain, or perhaps a voice speaking just beyond the range of human hearing. "Are you hearing that?" A guard's voice crackled over the general comms channel one evening. "Just static," another guard replied, their tone dismissive. "No, not static. It's a sound." Thomas leaned closer to his own comms unit, adjusting the frequency. The whispers were there, faint but undeniable, like 1,000 tiny voices speaking in unison, just below the threshold of comprehension. He tried to filter out the static, to isolate the pattern, but it was too ephemeral. A detective offered no refuge. Thomas's nightmares, which had been a constant companion since arriving on the moon, intensified. They were vivid, visceral, filled with vast, echoing caverns and a crushing sense of being watched. He would wake in a cold sweat, the memory of a deep, resonant hum vibrating in his bones. He wasn't alone. A specialist circulated through the mess hall, hushed conversations about disturbing dreams, shared anxieties. "My dreams are getting worse," a pilot confessed one morning, stirring a nutrient paste with a vacant stare. "I keep seeing shapes," a technician under the surface. "Mine too," Thomas admitted, his voice low. He didn't elaborate on the feeling of being called in his dreams, a persistent, silent beckoning that pulled at his very core. The whispers on the comms became a source of growing paranoia. Thomas spent hours in the lab, trying to correlate the comms interference with the seismic readings, the pulsing fragments. He ran spectral analyses on the ambient electromagnetic field, searching for anomalies. The lead scientist, though still outwardly composed, showed signs of strain, her eyes shadowed, her movements more deliberate. Elias, however, seemed invigorate, observing everything with an unsettling calm. "The patterns are there," Thomas announced to the lead scientist one cycle, gesturing to a complex waveform on a display. It was a visual representation of the faint comms whispers, now isolated and amplified. "It's not just static. It's a complex, structured signal, a colleague in the moon's ambient electromagnetic field." The lead scientist peered at the display, her brow furrowed. "A natural phenomenon?" "I don't think so," Thomas replied, his voice grim. "It correlates directly with the heartbeat pulse, and with the molecular structure of the fragments. It's a form of communication, or a call." An agent they finished discussing the implications, an alarm blared through the base, a piercing, urgent wail that cut through the low hum and the unsettling whispers. Thomas's stomach dropped. "EVA team, the colleague is offline." A controller's voice shrieked over the comms, laced with panic. "Comms lost. A guard transmission garbled." Thomas sprinted to the control room, the lead scientist right behind him. The main screen displayed the last known coordinates of EVA, the figure Alpha, a remote survey site several kilometers from the base. The comms channel for the team was a cacophony of white noise, punctuated by bursts of frantic, incomprehensible speech. "Filter for voice?" The lead scientist barked at a controller, her face pale. The controller worked feverishly, isolating a few seconds of the last transmission. It was heavily distorted, but a voice, thin and terrified, cut through the static. The voice. It's everywhere. It's calling. Then silence. A chilling, absolute silence that filled the control room, far more terrifying than any scream. Thomas felt the low thrum in his teeth intensify, a cold dread seeping into his bones. The moon wasn't just waking, it was reaching out, and it had taken one of them. The control room hummed with a frantic energy that felt almost tangible, a stark contrast to the chilling silence that had followed the last garbled transmission. Thomas felt the low thrum in his teeth, a vibration that had now spread through his entire skull, a dull ache behind his eyes. The main screen still showed the last known coordinates of the lost EVA team, a blinking red dot against the stark lunar landscape. "We need to send a recovery team," the lead scientist declared, her voice sharp, cutting through the rising panic. A colleague gaze swept across the anxious faces of the controllers. "A rescue mission." "No," Thomas said, his voice surprisingly steady despite the tremor in his hands. He stepped closer to the main display, pointing at the coordinates. They weren't just lost. They were taken. That last transmission. The voice, it's everywhere. It's calling. It's not interference. It's the signal. The one I isolated. A controller, his face ashen, looked up. "But what do you mean, taken?" "The same thing that's been causing the power fluctuations, the whispers on the comms," Thomas explained, his mind racing. "It's reaching out, and it just grabbed an entire team." He turned to the lead scientist. "We can't just send another team blindly. We need to understand what we're facing. The fragments. The engineered shell. It's all connected to that site." The lead scientist stared at the screen, then at Thomas, her expression a complex mix of fear and scientific curiosity. "What do you propose?" "We go to the site," Thomas said, his voice firm. "Not for rescue, not yet. A colleague reconnaissance. We need to see what's there, what they found." A security officer, a stern figure with a hardened face, stepped forward. "That's a direct breach of protocol, Thomas. We secure the base. We don't send more personnel into a potential hazard zone." "The hazard zone is the entire moon, officer," Thomas countered, gesturing vaguely around the control room. "It's already inside. We're just waiting for it to decide what to do next. Agent, we want to survive. We need answers. And they're at that site." The lead scientist considered his words, her gaze distant for a moment. "He's right," she finally conceded, her voice low. "Containment has failed. We need to understand the threat. A guard, an EVA team, a figure personnel. Thomas, you're coming, and a technician for structural analysis, a guard for security." The journey to the remote survey site was fraught with a palpable tension. The lunar rover, usually a familiar rumbling cocoon, felt like a fragile shell against the vast, silent expanse. Thomas sat beside the driver, staring out at the desolate landscape. The low thrum in his bones was now a constant, unsettling companion, a deep resonance that seemed to vibrate from the very ground beneath the rover's wheels. He could almost hear the whispers, not through the comms now, but directly in his mind, a faint, rustling chorus that prickled at the edges of his sanity. When they reached the coordinates, the sight that greeted them was unlike anything Thomas had ever imagined. The drilling rig, which had pierced the engineered shell, now stood beside a colossal, jagged opening in the lunar surface. It wasn't a crater or a natural fissure. It was a wound, and from within that wound, a faint, ethereal glow pulsed, a soft, internal luminescence that painted the sharp edges of the opening with an otherworldly light. "My God," the lead scientist breathed, her voice hushed over the comms. "It's an entrance." Thomas felt a cold wave of dread wash over him, but also a strange magnetic pull. This was it, the source of the call. The EVA team's comms unit lay shattered near the entrance, its internal lights flickering weakly. There were no bodies, no signs of struggle, just the broken equipment and the gaping maw of the unknown. They approached the opening cautiously, their heavy boots crunching on the regolith. The air inside the opening, though still vacuum, felt different, colder, somehow heavier. The faint glow intensified as they descended into the chasm, revealing not rock, but something else entirely. Smooth, obsidian-like walls stretched down into the darkness, intricately carved with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the ambient light. "It's not natural," the technician whispered, his voice echoing slightly in Thomas's helmet. This is artificial, ancient. Thomas ran a gloved hand over the surface. The material was cool to the touch, almost slick, despite its hard appearance. The symbols were unlike any he had ever seen, a complex language of interlocking geometric shapes and flowing lines. He recognized the pattern, or elements of it, from the structured signal he had isolated. "These are hieroglyphs," Thomas stated, his voice tight with awe and terror. "And they're telling a story." A person they descended deeper, the chamber opened into a vast, cavernous space. The internal light pulsed rhythmically, casting long, dancing shadows that made the carvings on the walls seem to move. Thomas felt an overwhelming sense of age, of immense power contained within these walls. The air, or rather the lack of it, felt charged, heavy with an unseen presence. He moved towards a particularly large panel, covered in intricate carvings. He studied them, his mind working furiously to piece together the narrative. The symbols depicted a colossal, shadowy entity, a formless mass of malevolence, being contained by figures of light, graceful and powerful. The figures of light, which Thomas mentally dubbed the creators, were shown expending immense energy, sacrificing themselves to construct the very walls around them. "It's a prison," Thomas murmured, the realization a cold knot in his stomach. This entire structure, it's a containment unit. The lead scientist moved beside him, her helmeted head tilted. "For what?" Thomas pointed to the shadowy entity in the carvings. "This, a witness it is, and the creators. They sealed it away. They built this, and they died doing it." He traced a finger over a symbol that repeated frequently, a pulsating orb. "This is the heartbeat, the signal, it's the entity, and the whispers. Those are its attempts to manipulate, to breach its prison." "The moon isn't just a prison," Thomas continued, his voice strained. "It's also a tomb, a colleague, its jailers. The creators sacrificed themselves to keep this thing contained." He looked around the vast chamber, the pulsing light making the symbols seem to throb with a sinister life. "And we just drilled a hole in the lid." A low, guttural hum resonated through the chamber, not from the comms, but from the very walls around them. And it was angry. The low, guttural hum resonated through the chamber, not from the comms, but from the very walls around them. It was deeper, more resonant than anything Thomas had felt before. The light pulsed faster, brighter, casting stark, unsettling flashes across the ancient carvings. Thomas felt a pressure building in his ears, a feeling of being crushed from within. The whispers, no longer faint, coalesced into a distinct, agonizing chorus, 1,000 voices screaming in unison, just at the edge of comprehension. The ground beneath his boots vibrated violently. The entity was not just reaching out. It was pushing. And it was angry. "We need to go." The guard's voice crackled, laced with an unmistakable terror. "Now." Thomas nodded, his heart hammering against his ribs. They had found their answers. And the answers were far worse than any question he had ever dared to ask. The moon was alive, and its ancient prisoner was stirring, its malevolent influence now a tangible, suffocating presence. They had opened the door, and the prison was about to become their tomb. "Move!" Thomas shouted, his voice hoarse, the words swallowed by the rising hum. The pulsing light intensified, flickering with an erratic rhythm that made his eyes ache. He stumbled backward, away from the vast panel, the carvings now seeming to writhe with a life of their own. The technician, clutching his structural analysis device, let out a choked cry, pointing a trembling finger at the wall. "Look!" the technician yelled, his voice strained. A hairline crack, thin as a spiderweb, had appeared in the obsidian-like surface, directly over one of the pulsating orb symbols. As they watched, it lengthened, spidering outwards with sickening speed. A faint, almost imperceptible hiss emanated from it, like air escaping a pressurized chamber, though they were in a vacuum. The air, or rather the lack of it, felt even colder now, a chilling presence that seeped into Thomas's bones. "It's breaking through," the lead scientist breathed, her voice tight with horror. "The drilling. It created a weakness. It's exploiting it," Thomas corrected, his gaze fixed on the spreading fissure. The hum intensified, becoming a physical blow to his chest. He felt a wave of nausea, a sudden, irrational certainty that the walls were closing in, that the very rock of the moon was twisting itself around them. He shook his head, trying to clear the thought, but it clung, cold and damp at the edges of his mind. "Get to the rover," the guard ordered, pushing the technician forward. "Double time!" The ascent from the chasm was a blur of adrenaline and mounting dread. The whispers were louder now, a cacophony of distorted voices that seemed to claw at Thomas's sanity, whispering his name, promising him knowledge, power, release. He fought them, focusing on the rough texture of the ladder rungs beneath his gloved hands, the rhythmic crunch of regolith as they scrambled back to the rover. The ethereal glow from the opening pulsed like a dying heart, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to chase them. A colleague, the rover, the relative silence was a jarring contrast to the mental assault Thomas had just endured. But it wasn't truly silent. The low thrum from the moon was still there, an omnipresent vibration that seemed to have burrowed deep into the vehicle's chassis. The lead scientist was hunched over a comms panel, her face pale. "Base isn't responding clearly," she reported, her voice strained. "Static and fragmented voices, not ours." "It's inside," Thomas said, staring out at the opening, which now seemed to pulse with a furious, malevolent light. "It's already there." The journey back was punctuated by unsettling events. The rover's systems flickered erratically, the internal lights dimming and brightening without warning. The driver, usually stoic, gripped the controls so tightly his knuckles were white. Thomas could feel the tension, a palpable fear that seemed to thicken the air inside their small compartment. The whispers were no longer confined to his mind. He heard them now, faint, insidious murmurs on the comms, just beneath the static. "Did you hear that?" The technician suddenly snapped, spinning around in his seat, his eyes wide and unfocused. "Someone said my name, an agent there." He pointed a finger at the lead scientist. "Was that you?" No one said anything, the lead scientist replied, her brow furrowed with concern. "It's the comms, interference." "No," the technician insisted, his voice rising, a tremor of paranoia in it. "You're lying. I heard you. You're all in on it, aren't you? A guard to trick me." The guard placed a hand on the technician's shoulder. "Calm down. It's the stress. We're all feeling it." The technician flinched away, his eyes darting wildly. "Don't touch me. I know what you are. You're not real." He began to babble, his words disjointed, about shadows moving in his peripheral vision, about faces in the lunar dust. Thomas watched, a cold dread settling in his stomach. The entity wasn't just influencing them, it was breaking them. It was feeding on their fear, amplifying their suspicions, turning them against each other. This was its strategy. As they approached the base, the sight was alarming. The exterior lights flickered wildly, casting the familiar structures in an eerie, strobe-like glow. A figure surges visibly rippled along the habitat modules, sparks flying from exposed conduits. A deep, groaning sound, like metal under immense strain, vibrated through the rover, a sound that spoke of structural distress. "What's happening?" the driver gasped, pulling the rover to a jerky halt at the airlock. "The base is destabilizing," Thomas said, his voice grim. He could see cracks, not hairline fractures, but gaping fissures, snaking across the habitat's reinforced outer shell, emanating from the central drilling shaft. The same fault line that had appeared in the cavern was now tearing apart their sanctuary. The smell of burnt ozone was thick in the airlock as they cycled through. Inside, chaos reigned. A person blared intermittently, their shrill cries mixing with the shouts of panicked personnel. A controller was screaming at a monitor, accusing it of lying. A security officer was locked in a tense standoff with a maintenance worker, both brandishing tools, their faces contorted with suspicion. The low thrum was a roaring current here, a constant sickening vibration that rattled Thomas's teeth. "The drilling," Thomas stated to the lead scientist, pointing at a fresh, jagged crack running down a corridor wall. "The initial bore hole. It compromised the integrity of the shell. It's expanding. The entity is using it as a conduit, a point of leverage. We need to seal it," the lead scientist said, her eyes wide with terror as another crack shot across the ceiling. "Before the whole place implodes." "No," Thomas countered, a desperate plan forming in his mind. "Sealing it won't be enough. It's already inside. It's in our minds. A witness need to contain it, not just the hole." The air around them felt heavy, charged with an invisible malice. He could almost taste the fear, sharp and metallic, on his tongue. The entity was here, feeding. An officer need to fight it from the inside out. He looked around at the fractured, paranoid faces of the remaining crew, the structural integrity of their prison failing, their minds succumbing. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about preventing something truly ancient and malevolent from breaking free. "We need to understand how it works, how it influences. An officer need to fight it from the inside out." Thomas's voice, though firm, was barely audible above the rising cacophony of alarms and groaning metal. He looked at the lead scientist, her face a mask of profound terror. "Fight what, Thomas?" the lead scientist asked, her eyes wide, darting between the spiderweb cracks spreading across the reinforced wall. "We can barely think. It's in our heads." "Our minds," Thomas confirmed, the words tasting like ash. "Its influence." He felt a cold tendril of dread coil in his gut. This wasn't new. The same insidious whispers, the same creeping paranoia had plagued his last mission, the one that had ended in disaster, in accusations, in ruin. He saw their faces then, his old crew, their eyes glazed with fear, turning on each other just like now. The entity was a mirror, reflecting his greatest failure back at him. "It's worse than you know," the lead scientist whispered, pulling him from his haunting vision. A colleague voice was strained, as if she were wrestling with a terrible secret. Decades ago, before this facility was even a concept, there was another project. Not lunar, but similar phenomena were detected. A deep space probe, a colleague up, signatures, resonances. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the failing environmental controls. "What are you talking about? Why wasn't this in any of the mission briefings?" The lead scientist shook her head, a desperate tremor running through her. "Cover up, Agent Blackout. They died, Thomas. The others, the crew of that probe. They went mad, just like this. A guard on each other. The official report said equipment failure, radiation exposure. But it wasn't. It was it. The entity." The colleague voice dropped to a barely audible rasp. "I was part of the analysis team. Young, naive. A figure, the raw data, the patterns, the influence. They silenced me. A person, it all." A wave of nausea washed over Thomas. The whispers intensified, weaving the lead scientist's confession with fragments of his own past, twisting them into a grotesque tapestry of guilt. "Your fault. A witness, your fault. You let them die. You failed." He pressed a hand to his temple, fighting the psychic assault, the phantom sensation of his old crew's accusations. The bass groaned, a sound like a tortured beast, and a fresh crack, wide and jagged, tore through the wall beside them, spitting sparks from severed conduits. They believed the officer, the ancient civilization that built this prison, Left of failsafe, the lead scientist continued, her voice gaining a desperate urgency. Something to contain it if it ever woke. A last resort. Where? Thomas demanded, his eyes scanning the fractured corridor, the panicked faces of the remaining personnel. A technician was huddled in a corner, rocking back and forth, muttering to himself. A security officer had her weapon drawn, pointing it at a maintenance worker who merely looked bewildered. Lost? The lead scientist admitted, despair etched onto her face. The records were destroyed. But it's our only chance, Thomas. A detective breaks free entirely. A specialist if on cue, a section of the wall near the central shaft buckled inward with a sickening crunch. A technician and debris rained down. A colleague, the fresh, jagged tear, Thomas saw it. Not a creature of flesh and blood, not a solid form, but a pulsating, inky blackness, a void that seemed to drink the flickering light. It writhed, expanded, contracted, a living shadow, radiating an oppressive cold that seeped into his very bones. It was pure, malevolent energy, a wound in reality itself. He could feel its hunger, its ancient, simmering rage. The stench of ozone intensified, mixing with a new, acrid smell that was almost chemical, like burnt plastic and something far older, metallic and foul. The air grew heavy, thick with the entity's presence, making it hard to draw breath. The whispers were a roar now, and Thomas felt his own resolve waver. This was it. The end. A agent past failures, the deaths of his crew, the cover-up, the ancient horror. It all converged, a suffocating weight. But then, a flicker of defiance. A guard. This was the end. He wouldn't let it be a repeat. Not again. We find that failsafe, Thomas declared, pushing past the lead scientist, his voice ringing with a newfound desperate clarity. He had to. A colleague his past, for their future. We find it, or we die trying to put it back in its cage. Thomas pushed past the lead scientist, the acrid stench of ozone burning his nostrils, the entity's cold seeping into his bones. Where would they hide something like this? He demanded, scanning the fractured corridor. A security officer, eyes wide with a manic gleam, shoved a maintenance worker against a sparking conduit, muttering about traitors. The architects. They built this place, the lead scientist stammered, wrestling with her own thoughts, her gaze distant. Not just the containment, the whole facility, a colleague design. It's layered, agent spaces. Hidden where? Thomas pressed, the whispers in his mind growing louder, urging him to turn on the lead scientist, to doubt her, to see the fear in her eyes as a sign of betrayal. He clenched his jaw, fighting the insidious suggestion. We don't have time for riddles. A specialist, a structural engineer. He found anomalies in the original schematics, the lead scientist said, her voice barely a whisper as if the entity itself might hear. Sub-level 3, a sealed vault. They thought it was a power conduit junction, but the energy signatures, they were dormant. A guard complex for simple power. Sub-level 3, Thomas repeated, the words a lifeline. He glanced at the buckled wall, the pulsating void expanding, its cold tendrils reaching. Lead the way. The descent was a nightmare of groaning metal and flickering emergency lights. The air grew heavier with each level, thick with the entity's oppressive presence. Thomas could feel its hunger, a vast, ancient emptiness that threatened to consume his very will. They passed a technician curled into a fetal position, sobbing. A security officer stood guard over an empty supply crate, weapon raised, eyes darting at unseen threats. The whispers were a constant roar now, a chorus of accusations and doubts, twisting his memories of his old crew, their terrified faces, into grotesque caricatures. You failed them. You will fail these too. This way, the lead scientist urged, her hand trembling as she pointed to a reinforced door, unlike any other in the facility, its surface a dull, featureless gray. It hummed faintly, a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated in Thomas's chest, a counterpoint to the entity's chaotic static. The schematics showed no access panel, a figure visible seams. Thomas examined the door, running a hand over its smooth, cold surface. It felt ancient, alien. How do we open it? The lead scientist fumbled with a datapad, her fingers clumsy. The specialist. He theorized a harmonic frequency, a specific sequence. It's not a lock, but a key. She typed frantically, her brow furrowed in concentration, muttering calculations under her breath. The air grew colder, and Thomas saw his breath mist in the dim light. The entity was closer, its icy tendrils probing at the edges of his mind. A soft click echoed, impossibly loud in the suffocating silence. The door didn't swing open. It dissolved, retracting into the wall with a barely audible hiss, revealing a chamber bathed in an ethereal blue-green glow. The light pulsed, casting long, wavering shadows that danced like specters. The air within was still, devoid of the entity's oppressive weight, almost breathable. "What is this place?" Thomas breathed, stepping inside. The floor was etched with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and flow. Apurse in the center stood a colossal, crystalline structure, spiraling upwards, humming with a deep, resonant energy. It was not a weapon, not a cage, but something far more complex, radiating a sense of profound, sorrowful power. The lead scientist stared, her mouth agape. The failsafe. It's real. A witness they approached, a section of the crystalline structure shimmered, and a holographic projection flickered to life. An officer image formed. Not a creature, but a series of geometric symbols. Then an ethereal, robed figure, its face obscured by shadow, its voice echoing in their minds, not through sound waves, but directly into their consciousness. They built this prison. They contained the hunger. But all prisons erode. A colleague cages break. The voice was ancient, weary, yet filled with an undeniable authority. This is not a weapon to destroy, but a seal to reforge. A detective bind the entity once more. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the chamber's temperature. What does it do? It requires a conduit, a living mind, a profound sacrifice of self to channel the energy needed for resealing. The architect's message continued, its tone solemn. The entity feeds on fear, on discord. It whispers. It corrupts. A colleague past failures, the whispers you heard. They were its nascent touch, a test of its growing strength. It seeks to break free, to consume all life, all thought, all existence. Thomas stumbled back, the architect's words slamming into him with the force of a physical blow. A specialist past, his guilt, the faces of his lost crew. It wasn't just his fault. It was it. The entity had been there, a silent, insidious puppeteer. A cold rage, pure and focused, ignited within him, burning away the self-pity. Sacrifice? The lead scientist whispered, her eyes fixed on the crystalline structure, a dawning horror on her face. A living mind. It needs a living mind to power it. The architect's projection began to fade, its final message a dire warning. If it escapes, there will be nothing left but silence. It will consume light, warmth, memory. A colleague will be undone. Thomas looked at the lead scientist, then back at the humming crystal. The whispers outside the chamber were a distant, frustrated roar now, as if the entity sensed its potential defeat. This wasn't just about survival. It was about redemption. "How do we activate it?" he asked, his voice steady, resolute. "Tell me everything." "How do we activate it?" Thomas asked, his voice steady, resolute. "Tell me everything." The lead scientist turned from the crystal, her eyes wide, reflecting the ethereal glow. The architect's message. It spoke of a conduit, a living mind to channel the energy. It's not a switch, Thomas. It's a focus, a profound act of will directed into the core. She gestured to the spiraling crystal, which thrummed with increasing intensity, sending vibrations through the floor. The specialist's notes, the ones about the harmonic frequency for the door. He theorized the failsafe itself operates on a similar principle. Not physical force, but resonant thought. A living mind, Thomas repeated, the words tasting like ash. He looked at the vast, intricate structure, then back at the lead scientist, her face pale in the fluctuating light. And the sacrifice. It's a permanent thing? She nodded slowly, a profound sadness settling over her features. The energy required to reseal something of this magnitude. It would consume the mind, the very essence of the individual. It's not just a power source, Thomas. It's a lock, a final, desperate binding. The colleague gaze drifted to the door, now a shimmering, translucent wall of energy, beyond which the cacophony of the entity's rage was growing. The whispers intensified, clawing at Thomas's sanity, painting images of his past failures in vivid, agonizing detail. Weak. Useless. You let them die. There has to be another way, Thomas insisted, the cold dread seeping into his bones. He clenched his fists, fighting the psychic assault. The air in the chamber grew heavy, the blue-green light flickering as if struggling against an external force. The lead scientist shook her head, her resolve hardening. The architect's message was clear. This facility, this prison, it's failing. The entity is too strong now. It's already broken through the outer layers. A colleague have minutes, Thomas, not hours. She took a step towards the crystal, her hand reaching out. The specialist. He believed the energy signature of the failsafe was dormant, waiting for a conscious catalyst. A mind strong enough to withstand the initial surge, to direct it. You can't, Thomas said, a sudden sharp fear piercing through his own battle with the whispers. He saw the quiet determination in her eyes, the same look he'd seen in the faces of those who knew their end was near. There's no other way, Thomas, she whispered, her fingers brushing the cold, smooth surface of the crystal. A faint warmth emanated from the point of contact, spreading outwards. I know this place. I understand the schematics. A agent mind. It's already attuned to its frequencies. I've been studying them for years, trying to understand what we found. Guard the chamber. The station groaned, a sound of tortured metal and buckling bulkheads. A distant, guttural roar echoed through the facility, shaking the very ground beneath them. The blue-green light pulsed wildly, casting their shadows in frantic, dancing contortions. No! Thomas lunged forward, but she was already pressing her hands flat against the crystalline structure, her eyes closing. A jolt of energy visibly coursed through the crystal, flaring brightly, making the intricate patterns on the floor glow with an inner fire. The activation sequence, Thomas! She cried, her voice strained, a raw power building around her. A colleague body began to shimmer, a faint, almost imperceptible distortion in the air. The central console. The override. You have to complete it. Now. Thomas hesitated for only a fraction of a second, the image of her sacrificing herself searing into his mind. The whispers screamed louder, a chorus of malevolent glee, but he pushed past them, fueled by a rage that burned hotter than any fear. Not again. Not this time. He sprinted to a small, recessed panel on the crystal's base, which now glowed with an inviting, almost hypnotic light. He slammed his palm against it, following an instinct, a sudden clear understanding of the architect's design. The crystal flared, a blinding white light erupting from its core, engulfing the lead scientist. A colleague form dissolved into pure energy, her final silent scream absorbed by the colossal structure. The chamber filled with a deafening, high-pitched whine that vibrated through Thomas's very bones, forcing him to his knees. The entity's roar, previously distant, became an immediate, earth-shattering bellow of pure, unadulterated fury, shaking the entire moon base to its foundations. Thomas could feel its immense power, its desperate struggle, as the ancient, sorrowful energy of the failsafe surged, binding it once more. He pressed harder against the panel, his teeth gritted, sweat stinging his eyes, the metallic tang of ozone filling his mouth. The light pulsed, then began to recede, drawing inwards, pulling the entity's chaotic energy with it. The roar faded into a frustrated, dying shriek, then silence. A cold, profound silence. The blue-green glow returned, steady and calm, illuminating the empty space where the lead scientist had stood. The crystal hummed, no longer with a frantic energy, but with a deep, resonant peace. Thomas slowly pushed himself up, his body trembling, his ears ringing. He was alone in the chamber, the air still thick with the ghost of ozone, the silence heavier than any sound. The whispers were gone. The chamber settled into an unnerving quiet, a profound stillness that pressed in on Thomas. A colleague's ears screamed with a high-pitched whine, a phantom echo of the energy surge that had consumed the lead scientist. The air, thick with the metallic tang of ozone, felt heavy, cold, as if the very warmth had been sucked from it. He pushed himself up, his body trembling, every muscle aching, his vision blurry at the edges. The blue-green glow of the crystal, now steady and calm, cast long, distorted shadows around him, highlighting the empty space where she had stood. He was alone. Utterly, irrevocably alone. A faint hum resonated from the crystal, deep and sorrowful, a sound that vibrated not just in the air, but in his bones, in the deepest recesses of his mind. It was the sound of a lock, a seal, but also a presence. Dormant, yes, but not gone. The entity was still there, a vast, malevolent consciousness held captive, its anger a faint, persistent thrum beneath the moon's barren surface. This was the unbearable knowledge. The station groaned around him, a tortured symphony of stressed metal and buckling bulkheads. Agent motes danced in the blue light, stirred by unseen tremors. He had to move. He had to warn them. Stumbling, Thomas made his way out of the chamber, past the shimmering, translucent door that now pulsed with a faint, steady energy. The corridor beyond was a disaster. A guard conduits dangled from the ceiling, sparking erratically. Figured doors lay mangled, ripped from their frames. He navigated the wreckage, his boots crunching on shattered glass and debris, the silence oppressive, broken only by the station's death throes and his own ragged breathing. The air grew colder with every step, the artificial warmth of the habitat failing. He found the main comm station in a state of disarray. A person were ripped open, wires exposed, sparking with dangerous energy. A screen flickered weakly, displaying garbled data. Thomas ignored the danger, his mind fixed on a single purpose. He clawed at the ruined console, his fingers, numb with cold, fumbling with the controls. He needed a signal, any signal. A faint, static-laced hiss filled the comms bay. He leaned closer, straining to hear. "Lunar Alpha, do you copy?" The voice was distant, crackling, barely audible, yet it was there. A human voice. "This is the colleague command. A witness status report?" Thomas grabbed the receiver, his hand shaking. "This is Thomas," he rasped, his throat raw. "Lunar Alpha. Compromised." Compromised? The voice, a female operator, sounded confused, her tone laced with static. "We're reading. Anomalous energy signatures. What is your status, Thomas? Where is the lead scientist? She's gone, Thomas whispered, the words catching in his throat. He could still feel the hum, the entity's lingering presence, a cold dread seeping into his very core. Sacrificed herself. Officer, reseal it. A pause, filled with crackling static. Reseal what, Thomas? What are you talking about? We're losing you. A detective, your last transmission. The moon. It's a prison, Thomas said, his voice gaining a desperate urgency. An ancient entity